Welcome back to Shaar HaYichud of the Mittler Rebbe, Chapter 1, Part 3. We left off talking a bit about an analogy, about how a river spread forth from Eden. We'll return to that now. Let me just look inside the text here. V'nahar yote me'eden chulu, and a river went forth from Eden. And what we mean by that is, shehabina nikra nahar, v'achachma nikra ma'ayin. Bina is called a river, and Chachma is called a wellspring. So Bina, understanding, is called a river, which is the expansive form of the wellspring, which is referred to as Chachma, or insight. And the reason for the comparison, as you probably know, is that just like the water droplets of a wellspring are expanded upon it to form the river, or the different dimensions of the river, in a similar fashion, when we have an insight, we need to analyze it in order to unpack, so to speak, the details embedded in that insight and expand upon it in the mind of comprehension or understanding. Kiyadu, as is known, so this is a well-known analogy. V'hu hanikra iyun she'omed al davar hamuskal ma'ayin bo harbe me'od shehu ha'ikuv hepech ha'mehirus. Now, what we mean when we use the term iyun, which translates to analysis, is that we stand on the concept and analyze it very much, which is a process that entails pause and restraint, which is the opposite of just studying something in a rapid fashion, just to cover ground, so to speak, which would be a more superficial form of study, which we referred to previously as girsa type study, or surface study. And the purpose of this deeper analysis is specifically in order to come to the very depth and essence of the concept that we're studying. Not just to learn something about it, not just to learn a few details, but to try to grasp all the different details that define it and view this concept from all of its facets. And if we receive different explanations and analogies, we can safely assume that each of those are meant to express the concept we're studying uniquely, and it's important not just to understand the explanations in their own right, but to engage in some compare and contrast, to understand the unique contribution of each to our understanding of the concept. Kamo, and this is comparable to, the Mittler Rebbe is going to give an example here, and this example is going to jive with the example we learned earlier about the different manners in which someone can look at something. A person can look at something in just a passing sort of a way, and a person can look at something in a deep sort of a way where they really study the details of what they're looking at in order to try to understand it better. Kamo hamistakal al davar ma be'eino, this is like someone who gazes at something with their eyes, v'lo b'havara ba'alma, and not just in a passing sort of a way, but rather ela b'pikuach utvius eino, but rather with an intelligence and a fixing of their eyes, be'ikuv gadol, with great restraint, ad sheyodea oso hetav b'kol chalakav hapnimim v'toch tocho chulu, until they understand this thing that they're looking at with all of its inner and outer parts. And we can infer from this latter statement that it's not the case that a person is just focusing on something with their eyes alone and thinking that will get them to the depth, but again, they're studying what they're looking at, and they're thinking about what they're looking at, and they're analyzing what they're looking at in order to understand it. V'hu hanikra hisbonenus benura kapul, and that is why the term hisbonenus, contemplation, right, which we said was synonymous with the word iyun, which we translated as analysis. Just when it comes to the revealed dimensions of Torah, like Talmud, we use the term iyun, whereas when it comes to like Kabbalistic and Hasidic study, we tend to use the term hisbonenus, but they mean the same thing. And now the Mittler Rebbe shows us how that's hinted at by the spelling of the word hisbonenus, which grammatically speaking, could have been spelled with one letter nun, but in fact was spelled with 2-letter nuns. Well, what does that have to do with anything, right? So each of the letters in the Hebrew alphabet has a numeric value. This is called numerology or gematria. And the truth is they're different ciphers, so to speak, and they're different numeric values that you could assign to each. But in its most basic form, the letter Nun would have the value of 50. Later in this book, we'll learn together, God willing, that there are 50 quote-unquote gates of understanding. And in our discussion, then we'll discuss, what that means. Obviously, we're using the term gate figuratively. And why 50, why not 49, why not 51? We'll talk about all that. But the point is that because the letter Nun has the value of 50, it can be seen as hinting at the 50 gates of understanding within Bina, within the realm of comprehension. And because Hisbonenus, which is translated as contemplation, and many times I actually translate it analysis here since that's what it means. They're synonyms, in this context. This process of Hisbonenus makes use of and entails, exploring these different gates of understanding. And so that's why the word Hisbonenus is spelled with 2-letter nuns, because there's an emphasis on repetitive analysis. Not repetition alone, not thinking that if we visualize or articulate or consider a concept a certain number of times, that considering it a certain number of times will result in understanding it better. No, considering something a certain number of times superficially will not result in depth of understanding per se. What will result in depth of understanding is repetitive analysis, meaning continuing to mull over the details that define a concept in our mind and comparing and contrasting it with other concepts and really studying it. And the more we study it, the more that, God willing, we'll grasp it to its depth and, everything that results from that. And we'll talk about that part here in this book together. In other words, a person contemplates and analyzes what they're studying greatly. Like the commentary of Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, the famous commentary, the famous Torah commentary. He has commentary on the written Torah, he has commentary on the oral Torah, right? Rashi defines the term iyun, analysis, which we said was synonymous with the term hisbonenus, to stand on something in order to understand it clearly, etc. Okay, so just to summarize what we learned today, we again went back to making sure that we understood that the term hisbonenus and the term iyun are synonymous. We also talked about what that would be like. And the analogy of someone looking at something, it would be like they're looking at something in a detailed, analytic way, as opposed to just kind of glancing at it superficially. And in the next section, just to give you a little sneak preview, we're going to take those same 3 dimensions of depth, width, and length that we talked about in the context of Bina, or understanding, and look at those same 3 dimensions in the context of Chachma, or insight, and the relationship between the two. We saw a little bit about the relationship between the two in the sense that we learned the insight of Chachma is expanded in the mind of Bina, but we'll have to talk about that in a little bit more depth in the next class. Thank you for joining.